Okay, thank you so much. For those tuning in to the live stream, either on Facebook Live or through YouTube, my name is Rabbi David Barnett. I'm the rabbi here of Congregation Beth Am, located in Longwood, Florida. We are very graciously hosted under the auspices of the Life Point Church. And to that extent, we give our great thanks and appreciation to Jason, both institutionally and personally here. Thank you so much, Jason, for setting us up here and for assisting in our broadcast this morning. And first and foremost, Jewish tradition. If you go back to the story of Abraham in the Bible, what did he do? Even right after he was circumcised. Now imagine, it's a little hard to walk and things like that after you've been circumcised. Immediately after, he was in recovery. But some guests came. He didn't know that they were angels. We never know who the angels are in our midst. Angels are very important. I spoke about them last night. But he thought they were just ordinary people, but they in fact happened to be angels. And he just didn't walk slowly to them. He ran out to meet them. As much as he could run under the circumstances. Let's call it a quick walk. So we want to welcome two new friends here of our community who are here in our synagogue today for the first time, at least the first time that I've seen them. And that is first, wait a minute here now, Alja with the soft G. Alja, wait a minute, Campbell. Yes, Alja Campbell, and her sister, Carla McLeod Campbell. Did I get that right? Pardon me? Oh, okay, I'm sorry, okay. So Carla McLeod, there we go, okay. So we really want to welcome you both to our community here today and our services. And we will be beginning and continuing with our service here on page 146 we have no shortages we have Mark, could you hand them another? I think because it looked like that we put some away earlier because we didn't think too many people would be showing up under the weather, but you can each have your own book for sure. There we go. Yes, and of course Sidur comes from the root Seder, and which means order. And that's what we have the Passover meal. We call it a Seder. And why do we call it that? Because that has a certain order. That's a different story coming up. But the order of our services begins then, page 146, with the early morning blessings. And it is traditional, if possible, to rise for this. So I'll chant them in Hebrew on this page. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher naten l'sechvi vina lavchin ben yom uven laila. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani b'tzalmo. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani ben chorin. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, she'asani Yisrael. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, pokeach ivrim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, malbish arumim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, matir asurim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, zokev kebufim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, roka haaretz al hamayim. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, shasali kol tzorki. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher ayechin mitzadik aver. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, ozer Yisrael b'gvura. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, oter Yisrael b'tifara. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, hanoten leyayef koach. And please be seated. God willing, we'll get to know Alja and Carla better here in further conversation, but I just want to mention for those in our listening audience as well that sometimes people are coming to the liturgy anew. It can be a little intimidating, and my message to you is al tifhad, do not be afraid. Do not be intimidated by this, because in point of fact, there are new methods of teaching Hebrew that have been developed. And it's actually now relatively easy to learn how to decipher Hebrew in the course of 3 months. And we just had a gentleman arrive who is in our class, and our president is in the class that I'm teaching. And they are doing very, very well. And inside of 3 months, with the best curriculum that I believe has ever been developed in the world by a friend of mine, I'm going to give him international acclaim now. His name is Owen Meldy, and that curriculum is coming along. So if someone is listening online and would like further information, or those in person, you can contact me, and we can figure out how to re-begin. That having been said, we will continue here on page, let's go to right now, page 150. Page 150. And there's the paragraph that begins Ashreinu. Now, traditionally, many of these early morning things are done in Hebrew exclusively, but we will do some things in English here as well. So on page 150 in the English, in joyous thanksgiving, let's recite this. Ashreinu, how fortunate we are, how good is our portion, how pleasant is our lot, how beautiful is our heritage. How fortunate are we that twice each day, morning and evening, we can declare. Now we'll go reserve the next line for the Hebrew. Ashreinu ma tov chelkenu, u'ma na'im go'aleinu ma yafai v'rushatenu, ashreinu shanachnu mashkivim u'ma'arivim erev haboker, ve'omrim pamayim b'chol yom, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. And at this time, we're going to go ahead here to let's move ahead to the psalm for the Shabbat, which I believe here is going to be on page 169. Page 169. Let's read responsively. The Sabbath Psalm, a psalm, a song for the Sabbath day. It is good to thank you, O Lord, to sing praises to your exalted name, to proclaim your love every morning and your faithfulness every night, to the sound of the 10-string lyre with voice and the music of the harp. Your words, O Lord, bring me gladness. Of your deeds I sing with joy. How great are your deeds, O Lord! How profound are your designs! The simple cannot comprehend, the foolish cannot grasp this. Though the wicked may thrive like grass and doers of evil seem to flourish, their doom is sure to come, for yours is the ultimate triumph. Those who oppose you will perish, the workers of iniquity will be routed. You have given me extraordinary power. I am like one who has been anointed. I see the defeat of my foes. I hear the doom of my enemies. The righteous will flourish like the palm tree. They will thrive like the cedar of Lebanon. Planted in the house of the Lord, they will flourish in the courts of our God. Even in old age, they will bear fruit, retaining their vigor and their strength, proclaiming that the Lord is just, my rock, in whom there is no unrighteousness. And some of these, I just want to point out here, some of these little introductory lines here are sort of stage cues. When they had the temple service, they would have like, they would have directions, stage directions. And so, for example, Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbat, that was really maybe part of an original stage direction. And the one before it, today's the Holy Sabbath, which the Levites, so the Levites would stand. They would know to do that. So speaking of stage directions, actually, Jason, if you could go back to the mic and maybe just raise it just a little bit more the way it was, that would actually help me. Then I can even put it a little farther away from me. I'm going to give the concluding 2 lines from that. We are on page 168. Laki ki yashar Adonai tzuri velo avlata bo. And thank you very much. And that's perfect. konei shamayim va'aretz. Nehalel lecha u'neshebecha u'nevarecha u'nevarech et shem kodechecha kamur David. Baruchi nafshi et Adonai v'chol kravai et shem kodesho. Ha'el v'tatmod u'zecha hagadol b'chvod shemecha hagibor netzach v'anora b'noratecha hamelech hayushev al kisei ram v'nisam. So by way of introduction, here we have completed now the beginning portion of the service, consisting of the early morning Birchot HaShachar, which we stood and recited, the early morning blessings, and then a section of the Psalms, the Pesukei de Zimra, songs of praise, of song. And now we continue with the beginning of the formal Shacharit, the morning service, Shochen Ad. And I always like to joke around that in big, well, it's not just joking, it's telling the fact that in traditional synagogues, big ones, the Orthodox kind that used to have in Brooklyn, you would have 3 or 4 cantors. So they wouldn't have the top cantor at this point in the service. People are still coming in, they're waking up. So you'd have a second, a third, or even a 4th cantor, or even someone from the congregation who would be honored to daven shacharit, to lead the shacharit prayers. And then they say the great cantor, the big cantor, the head cantor, the chazan harishon for the Musaf service. But that having been said, so this is at least where some cantor, some chazan would come in normally here on Shochen Ad. Page 218. Shochen Ad marom v'kadosh shemo v'chatuv ranu tzadikim b'Adonai Laisharim navati lam B'fi sharim titalal Uvdivrei tzadikim titvarach Uvilashon chasidim titaromam Uvekarev kadoshim titkadash Uvmakalot ravot amcha beit Yisrael V'rinai pa'er shimcha malkeinu lechol dor vador Sheken chovat kol yitzim levanecha Adonai Eloheinu v'levoteinu להודות, להלל, לשבח, לפאר, לרומם, להודיע, לברך, לקלס על כל דברי שירות ותשבחות. דוד בן ישי, עבדך משיחך, ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו. אל המלך הגדול והקדוש בשמיים וארץ, כי לך נא אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו. ברוך אתה אדוני אל מלך גדול בתשבחות אל ההודעות אדון הנפלאות הבוחר בשירי זמרה מלך אל חיי העולמים. At this point, I'm going to actually, for those of you who are standing, we're just going to continue on page 224 with the blessing that would be found after the Baruch Hu. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam yotzer or v'rei choshech osei shalom u'vorei hakol. Please be seated. We continue page 226. Hakol yiducha v'kol yishabechucha v'kol yomrin kadosh k'Adonai hakol yiromemuch asher yotzer hakol. We continue individually for a few lines. And now we'll continue at the bottom of page 226. Ein ke'erkecha. Ein ke'erkecha Adonai, ein ke'erkecha b'inzalatecha, efes bildecha u'midome lach. Ein ke'erkecha Adonai Eloheinu ba'olam hazeh, ve'in tzilatcha malkeinu l'chayei ha'olam haba. Efes bildecha go'elenu limot ha'mashiach, ve'in dome lecha moshienu. Nitchiat hametim. And on page 228, let's do El Adon al kol ha'masim baruch umvorach b'fi kol neshama gadlo v'tuvo ma'ale olam dat u'dvuna sovavim oto per v'chavod notelim nishmo Tzala v'rina lezecher malchuto
קרא לשמש ויזרח אור, רע והתקין צורת הלבנה. שבח נותנים לו כל צבא מרום, תפארת וגדולה, שרפים ואופנים וחיות הקודש.
We continue, page 230. לאל אשר שבת מכל המעשים. ועל מורה אור שתית יברכוך סלם. Because this is not a weekday, we gloss over page 232 and continue on page 234. תתברך צורנו מלכנו וגואלנו בורא, קדושים ישתבח שמך לעד מלכנו. כולם אהובים, כולם ברורים, כולם גיבורים, וכולם עושים במאורה רצון קונם, וכולם פותחים מפיהם בקדושה ותורה, בשירה וזמרה, מברכים ומשבחים, ומפארים ומעריצים ומקישים וממליכים את שם האל המלך הגדול, הגיבור והנורא, קדוש הוא. וכולם מקבלים עליהם עול מלכות שמיים זה מזה, ונותנים רשות זה לזה להקדיש שירותכם, ונחת רוח בשפה ברורה ונימה קדושה. כולם כאחד עונים ואומרים ביראה, קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך על הארץ כבודו. ואבנים וחיות הקודש ברעש גדול מתנסים למצרפים, למתם משבחים ואומרים ברוך כבוד אדוני ממקומו. And on page 236, I'm going to use the page turn to give a little review of a cantorial note. So Jewish services, the scale patterns in which Jewish services are done are in fact modal. That means they are done often to very ancient Middle Eastern modes. Now when I teach the song Hava Nagila to young children, so I teach them that song, and then for adults sometimes I even call this, or when I'm teaching even those students bar and bar mitzvah, I call it the Hava Nagila mode. So, bam, 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 ba, hava nagila, hava nagila, hava nagila, v'nismacha, bam, bam, bam. That's an ancient Middle Eastern scale. Bam, 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 bam. People know about octaves, you know, a long time ago. An octave in the physical universe is a doubling of vibrations on a wavelength. Basically, you can take a string, cut it in half, and it'll be an octave higher. If it waves, if it vibrates there. So within that octave, then you had these patterns. Bum 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 bum. For those who are musical, that was a lowered going up. Instead of a major scale, it was a lowered sixth and a lowered seventh. But then underneath the tonic, the main tone, bum 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 bum. That's the raised sixth note. So bum 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 bum. That's a little motif, and that's what we have here. So this part of the service, actually the remainder of the Shacharit service, is in the Hava Nagila modality. So for those who may be also listening on the internet, maybe you never knew that, but now you do. On the bottom of page 236. Or chadash ad Zion ta'ir v'nizkei chulanu mira leoro baruch ata Adonai yotzer hamirot. And on page 238 and 9, we have the Ahava Rabbah paragraph prior to the Shema, or one of the paragraphs. Really, it's the lead paragraph prior. We have had a request amongst many of our congregants actually to incorporate just a little bit more English reading on their Saturday service as well. That having been said, let's read today Ahava Rabbah in English responsively by stanza. At the top of page 239, the rabbis do tell us we can pray. It's kosher, it's allowed, it's permissible. to pray in any language. So since most of us do understand the English, often better than the Hebrew, let's go for it. With abounding love have you loved us, Lord our God. Great and overflowing tenderness have you shown us. Avinu Malkeinu, for the sake of our ancestors who trusted in you and whom you taught the laws of life, be also gracious to us and teach us. Merciful God, have compassion upon us. Endow us with understanding and discernment, that we may study your Torah with devotion. May we heed its words and transmit its precepts. May we follow its instruction and fulfill its teachings in love. Enlighten our eyes in your Torah and make our hearts cling to your commandments. Grant us singleness of purpose to love and revere you, so that we may never be brought to shame. For we trust in your awesome holiness. May we rejoice and delight in your deliverance. And now we come to page 240. For those who do have the talit, it's customary to gather the four corners of the talit, on which there are these woven strands in various knot formations. They are referred to as, of course, the tzitzit, and serve as a visual tag, a visual reminder of the commandments, the unity of God, the Jewish tradition as a whole, which we are about to utter and affirm momentarily through our recitation of the Shema. So the Shema will be, I'm going to announce it now, because traditionally really not supposed to have a break between this final blessing here on page 240 and the recitation of the Shema, which we will go and then continue on 242, and then continue into the paragraph after it, what we refer to as the Ve'ahavta, which is a commandment form. You shall love the Lord thy God. It's a future tense form in a way. So, V'havi'enu l'shalom. V'havi'enu l'shalom me'arba kanfot ha'aretz, v'tolichenu k'mumeo l'artzenu, ki alhu el shod ata, ובנו בחרת מכל עם ולשון, וקרבתנו לשמך הגדול סלע באמת, להודות לך ולייחדך באהבה, ברוך אתה אדוני. Now we're going to major, הבוחר בעמו ישראל, באהבה, אמן. שמע ישראל, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed. Ve'avta et Adonai Elohecha b'chol levavcha v'chol nafshecha u'v'chol meodecha ve'hayu hadvarim ha'ele asher anochi mitzavecha hayom al levavecha ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם ושבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ושוכבך ובקומך וקשרתם לאות על ידיך והיו לו תותפות בין עיניך וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We continue then, page 244 and forwards. On page 246, למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. So now, having completed the Shema, I want to go back to page 242 and talk about the Ve'ahavta in one little footnote. I mentioned that in the new Hebrew curriculum, the Hebrew, I call it new, relatively new, in the last 40 years, much newer than a 2,000-year tradition. But in this particular curriculum, one can learn to decipher Hebrew within a 3-month time frame. Our class members are demonstrating that. We're already, I think, have we moved to page 20, Toby? I can't remember. Yes, page 20, even maybe 21. I can't remember. Did we assign 21 also? We did, yes. So there's only 4 more pages to go, and then this class is going to be actually beginning actual prayers, and the culmination of them is going to be this paragraph here, the Via Havta. So it's pretty amazing, that having been said, we continue now, page 248. Page 248. Emet ve'atziv v'nachum v'kayam v'yashar v'ne'eman v'ahu v'haviv nehmad v'na'im v'nora v'adir metukan v'kubal v'tov v'yafei hadavar hazeh aleinu le'olam va'ed. לדור ודור הוא קיים ושמו קיים וכיסו נכון ומלכותו ואמונתו לעד קיימת ודבריו חיים וקיימים וקיימים נאמנים ונחמדים לעד לעולמים על אבותינו ועלינו ועל בנינו ועל גדורותינו ועל דורות ועל כל דורות זרעי ישראל עבדיך על הראשונים ועל האחרונים דבר טוב וקיים לעולם ועד. אמת ואמונה חוק ולא יעזור אמת שאתה הוא אדוני אלוהינו ואלוהי אבותינו מלכנו מלך אבותינו גואלנו גואל אבותינו יוצרנו צור שותנו פודנו מצילנו מעולם שמך אין אלוהים זולתך עזרת אבותינו אתה ומעולם page 250. תהילה לעליון ברוך ומבורך משה בני ישראל לך נשארה בשמחה רבה ויאמרו כולם. Actually, page 252 now. We continue with the מיכה מוחה. מיכה מוחה ואלים אדוני מיכה מוחה נדר בקודש נורא תהילות I think there's a drinking fountain. Tom, is there a drinking fountain in the hallway there? I'm not sure. Maybe we can help. Can help as I get some water.
We got some water bottles in the cooler. Yeah, let's give it a water bottle.
Okay, let's see. He'll help her there. So we continue Shira Hadashah. Because I just did the Micha Mocha, did I not? Yes, okay. Shira Chadasha Shibchu Geolim. Let me start that over. Shira Chadasha Shibchu Geolim L'Shimcha Al Sfat Hayam Yachad Kulam Hodu V'Imlichu V'Yamru Adonai Himloch Leolam Va'ed Tzur Yisrael Kuma Ve'ezrat Yisrael Ufedech Enumecha Yehuda V'Yisrael Go'aleinu Adonai Tzbaot Shemo Kedosh Yisrael Baruch At Adonai Gal Yisrael. So we're going to continue at this moment, I believe, individually here then for the Shabbat Amidah. That is found on page 255. Page 255. And we'll continue through page 266. If you're still completing the Amidah, can please continue to do so individually. And we can conclude it here also by the singing of Oseh Shalom, page 266.
Oseh Shalom bimromav, hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ve'imru amen. Ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael, ya'aseh shalom, shalom aleinu, ve'al kol Yisrael.
And we continue now on the back part of your Siddur, the back page. I'm going to jump ahead and do the blessing for those who are ill in our community. And as is our custom, I will chant the first paragraph composed by Debbie Friedman. I'll read the names that we have, and then we'll go around and ask if you have some to add. So,
Mi shebeirach avoteinu, mekor habracha limotenu. May the source of strength who bless the ones before us help us find the courage to make our lives a blessing, and let us say, Amen.
And we wish now a complete healing to Shelley Ackman, Steve Ashheim, Mona Bakov, Teresa Kalla, Emilia Cooley, Audrey Dash, Bruce Dash, Gordon Feinberg, Carla Gonzalez, Bunny Graham, Alan Jacobs, Rita Kindle, Norman Levin, Steve Lifshin, Sandy Minkin, Dom Salfi, Barbara Allman, Sawyer Bartel, Harleen Schreck, Leslie Schulsinger, Izzy Sigmund, Saul Stein, Bill Thompson, Peter Teitelbaum, Nancy Town, Herb Weissman, Suzette Weissman, Katerina Williams, Label Ben Margolit, Liba Shlomit Rachel Bat Margolit, Feivel Shlomo Ben Devorah, Israel Ben Etel, and Avram Ben Binyamin. So let's go around the room and see if there are others to add. I know some do. Starting in the back, Tom, do you have any? Okay. This side? In this, yes, Toby?
Tom Rapsatara, Rock Lindstrom.
Thank you. Mark, any? Okay. In the back there, I know Jeff. Thank you. Okay. Yes, you have...
Jenna Martel and Shirley Guzman.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other names to add? Either of you? Okay, that's good. I'm going to add a couple here. Rachel Sura bat Leah, Devorah Sarah bat Yosefina, and Yehuda ben Tzvi. And of course, Usha'ar HaCholim, שנמצאו בכל העדה שלנו, בכל היקרים שלנו. And now we will continue with the second stanza.
מי שברך אמותינו, מקור הברכה לאבותינו. Bless those in need of healing with refuah shlema, the renewal of body, the renewal of spirit, and let us say, Amen.
Okay. And so I'm going to ask for some, while I'm thinking of this now, I'm going to ask for some presidential direction. We have started as a congregation to mention the birthday celebrations and anniversary celebrations of those who are members of our congregation. And we read the names last night. If we do, this is a question for our president direction. If we read them on a Friday night, should we also read them the subsequent Saturday morning or not?
That's fine.
We should? We could? Okay. So celebrating birthdays in March from our congregation, we have Herb Weissman, Betsy Botwin, Lawrence Kaplan, Leslie Gordon, Kevin Colley, Simon Mendel, Stanley Levine, and Hetty Bernstein. And the anniversaries, on the 3rd of the month, it was Osvaldo Gonzalez Cruz and Wanda Garcia. On the 7th, Herb and Suzette Weissman. And on the 20th, Susan Geller and Bo Burgess. So we wanted to have a chance to mention those. So we have several things happening on this Shabbat. First, we have our regular Torah portion. And then there is a special Maftir portion, which I think probably we'll even go back and take a look at and actually read, which is starts with the word Zachor, and it involves the remembrance of the attack of the evil king Amalek on the Israelites as they were fleeing Egypt. And so every year since then, prior to Passover, there are 4 special Sabbaths that you have. And since basically, since between, let's just say, in the Jewish calendar, before Passover, you have the festival of Purim. And so Purim celebrates the deliverance, of course, of the Jewish people from the evil persecution and under the evil direction there of Haman, the vizier there in Persia at the time. And so what we do is the Sabbath before Purim, we remember this particular portion about Amalek. And the rabbis make a connection liturgically and really even maybe heritage-wise between Amalek of the Bible and later on, and the Amalekites, and later on actually Haman and his descendants back in Persia there. Whether or not it's genetically true, I don't know, but they make that liturgical kind of connection. And so therefore, on the Sabbath before Purim, we remember and we recall and read the passage about Amalek in the biblical section. And then there is a special Haftorah portion, which also mentions, basically a later time in Jewish history, during the time of the early kings there, where Saul was battling against the Amalekites. And so they were indeed direct descendants of the original Amalek, and it involves the period of Saul's kingship and the story on that, which I will go into later. And it had quite dramatic battle success and a quite dramatic fall from grace for Saul, Shaul, as the king at the time, under the spiritual direction of Samuel the prophet, and that's quite a dramatic story. So we'll come to that. But I thought I would talk here about a little bit about the Torah portion here, which is the beginning this week of the book of Leviticus, Vayikra, or Vayikra sometimes as it's pronounced. So I'm going to find the page here for us. And if you'll turn, there's a very nice introduction, right, which I think is, these are in the red Chumashim. Yes, they'll be passed out there to you. So what I'm going to do is just sort of point out several parts here of our introduction that I think are very, the introduction to this section, which I think is very informative. So I'll wait till you have your books there, most of you. If you'll turn to page 584, basically. That page does not have a number in the Eitz Chaim, but it's the page opposite 585. So I'll give you a chance just to turn to that. Page 585, in essence, is the first Hebrew line of the new book of the Bible there, Vayikra.
Which page? 585?
Page 585, yes. And I'd like to quote from the introduction here from Baruch Levine, just the first paragraph here, or maybe the first couple of paragraphs. I think it's worth noting his remarks. He said, popularly called by the Hebrew name, Vayikra, he called, which is its first word. Leviticus is known formally as Torat Kohanim, instructions for the priests. This title defines Leviticus as a prescription for the proper worship of the God of Israel. Then the next paragraph is important as well. The Hebrew Bible reflects the central concerns of the ancient Israelites. Perhaps the most vital of these was to know how they were to express their loyalty to the Lord. This very question is posed by the prophet Micah, who answers it by emphasizing the primacy of justice and love, ultimately desired by God more than sacrifice. So you remember Micah there, right? What does the Lord demand, right? So love justice, do mercy, and be faithful unto thy God, right? So he shortened it down, much shorter than the detailed kinds of prescriptions that we have here for the ordering and the details regarding the sacrifices, certainly in this chapter. Leviticus 19:2 gives a more specifically priestly answer to Micah's question. You shall be holy, for I, the Lord, your God, am holy. How Israel was to live as a holy nation is the burden of Leviticus, in other words, of this book of the Bible. Now, to bring this really here, I think, into a more specific context, I'd like to invite you to look at on page 585, the first paragraph at the top of the page in English. The principal types of sacrifices. Now, there's a note here that I think is very instructive. So it says chapters 1 to 7 outline the biblical sacrificial system as the Israelite priesthood administered it. The laws of the Torah did not permit Israelites to atone for intentional or premeditated offenses by bringing a sacrifice. So intentional or premeditated offenses, they were not allowed to atone by sacrifices, by animal sacrifices. So that's a very important point. In such instances, the law dealt directly with the offender, imposing punishments and acting to prevent recurrences. Gaining atonement through ritual sacrifice was restricted to situations in which a reasonable doubt existed about the willfulness of the offense. Even then, restitution was required if another person had suffered any loss or injury. So that's very, very significant to note that. First, restitution did have to be made one way or the other in any case. But in the situation then, again, of situations where there was an intentional or premeditated offense, the sacrifices that we read about here, that are read about here and described in the book of Leviticus, do not apply. They were not able to be enacted. Now, the section underneath of that is the first several paragraphs here, I think is very instructive also to give us a sense of how can we think of this and apply it really to the modern era. And then after we read these couple paragraphs, I'd like to really share some further thoughts on the notion of sacrifice as a whole, from its origins really to a much broader sense for us. Utilizing our opportunity to do that here today. So, for those, I'm going to read it for those who are in our, watching also in our live stream audience who may not have access to the Chumash. Leviticus is a difficult book for a modern person to read with reverence and appreciation. Its main subject matter, animal offerings and ritual impurity, seems remote from contemporary concerns. Yet almost half of the 613 mitzvot of the Torah are also, I'm going to add the word also, found in this book. The text with which young children traditionally begin their Jewish education. By the way, let's make a little question to interrupt the reading, my own reading here. Why would little children be introduced to this? What would you think here? Let's have a little participation. Why would you begin the education of little children with this book of the Bible, as opposed to some of the other stories which are much more childlike? Why begin with this?
Raising children is about teaching them the rules of the family, of the house.
Yes. So she said raising children is about teaching them the rules of the family and the house. That's right. And continue. That's correct. That's all correct. However, that sort of still begs the question, why this particular book as opposed to the earlier, more story-like books of the Bible, which had ethical lessons as well. Laws of reverence and respect, teaching, maybe sometimes how not to do things. The story of Cain and Abel, Cain killing his brother, and Jacob with his brothers, and all, etc. Jacob with his brother, Esau, but then Joseph with his brothers. Greg.
Well, maybe it's because children they don't have the experience to understand the abstract and metaphors as well. And maybe Leviticus, maybe the rules, and this is how you show devotion to God, this is how you conduct yourself in a godly way. Maybe it was deemed to be more kind of explicit.
Yes, okay. So what Greg shared is that sometimes children may have difficulty sort of enveloping and grasping the abstract, and this is a concrete kind of examples to give, but even most importantly was the end of what you said, to show them basically how to behave and show a reverence for God. And a respect for God is what I think your answer was implying there towards the end. And that's really what I think is the key here. Because these are, again, the whole concept of the sacrifice. What is, and this was something I wanted to share later anyway, and now would be even the ideally appropriate time to mention that. The name for a sacrifice in Hebrew is called korban. A korban. And as most Hebrew, practically all Hebrew, in essence, all Hebrew words have a root. Does anyone know the root of the word korban? First, let me spell korban out. It's kuf, resh, bet, final nun. Toby is getting close. Yes.
This comes from Rabbi Shapiro. Draw near to, or come close to, or approach, get near to God.
That is correct. What are the letters of the Hebrew root? So the word korban, the noun forms, sacrifice, a sacrifice or a sacrificial animal, is kuf, resh, bet, nun. Greg, I think, might have an answer.
I do know that. It's got to be and I thought it was a chaf, a resh, and then a bet.
No, there's no chaf in it. It's a kuf with a k.
Kuf, okay. Kuf, resh, and then bet. Because I'm thinking like karov.
Very good. He's getting red hot.
Right?
Karov, you knew the word karov, close. That's correct. Karov means close. And so the concept of the sacrifices in their mentality was to bring us closer to God. Now, in my Hebrew lesson this last week, I'm going to mention a point that is relevant now for these remarks, and you'll see how it all fits together. So I think it's on, I don't remember, maybe page 19. We had the word, we had the word midaber, mitaken, those words in our Hebrew curriculum, which is a masculine present tense form of the intensified form the PL form that I talked about, and you take out the Hebrew grammar is basically you have a simple form, and everything is in the whole system of Hebrew grammar develops from the roots. So you have a simple root, then an intensified form, and then a causative form. And both of those exist in active and passive forms. And that there's one other which is also reflexive. Now, the word karov, the root karev, means to be close to, right? To be close to. So if you are going to intensify, to make closer, to bring closer, then you bring in the intensive form, which is the PL form. Likarev is the name of the infinitive. To make closer. Likarev. And guess what the first person masculine singular form of that is? Mekarev. Just like medaber. So for everyone here, even those that are not let's have you do the Hebrew exercise even though you're not in the class. Some of you are not in the class. So I'm going to say the word for our listening audience and repeat it. Medaber. Mekarev. Mitaken. Okay, you get the m-a-e vowel form. And that's what's indicative of this. So mekarev is the active, intensified form of becoming closer. And that's what the korban is designed to do. Very good there, Greg. That was good. Therefore, let's continue with this paragraph. Our concern in reading Leviticus should be more than historical. This is what our ancestors used to believe and practice. It should be an effort to understand the religious needs that were met by these practices in ancient times, needs that we still confront today, on a human level, I would add, and the religious ideas that were taught in the process. So you see how this can become relevant, right? That we have these there were needs then, but we have also these present needs and the religious ideas that were taught in that process. He goes on here. The modern temper tends to discount prescribed ritual in favor of spontaneous religious expression. Like, do what you feel, right? Enact what you feel. Yet something in the human soul responds to ritual, whether it be the formality of a traditional wedding or the rituals of a sporting event or a public meeting. There is something comforting about the familiar, the recognizable, the predictable. There is something deeply moving about performing a rite that is older than we are, one that goes back beyond the time of our parents and grandparents. Also applicable, I will add, to funeral services. When people have a sudden loss, a shock, you want something that you can latch onto, and ritual does serve that function and stands in the gap of so many unanswered questions to say, this is how we help you make a transition from where you are to going beyond the immediate shock and grief of a loss. Continuing here, at crucial times, it is important for us to know that what we are doing it right. There is power in the knowledge that we are doing what generations of people before us have done in similar situations, something that other people in other places are doing at the same time and in the same way. And rituals, including prescribed prayers, tell us what to do and say at times when we cannot rely on our own prayers of inspiration to know what to do or say. Many times, for example, when you're in a state of loss. A loss not only of loss and grieving, but loss of knowing what to say. And of just not knowing how to continue. Now, the next quotation is a quotation indicated by Schorsch. I have a feeling this may be Ismar Schorsch, the recent, the former chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary. Ritual is a way of giving voice to ultimate values. Each of us needs a sense of holiness to navigate the relentless secularity of our lives. And I may be mistaken. Ismail Shosh, he may have been the librarian at the seminary there. For the Israelites of biblical times, it must have been gratifying to know that what to do when they wanted to approach God at the crucial moments of their lives in need or in gratitude. And there is something you can read on your own. There's some discomfort about animal sacrifices per se. Some didn't like it, even including the great Rabbi Maimonides. But nonetheless, for many, it was certainly something that was, as Greg alluded to earlier, something that is concrete and alive and vibrant in front of you. But we stopped at animal sacrifices. We stopped at animal sacrifices in the very beginning of our tradition, with the story of the creation, actually the beginning of the Jewish tradition, with Abraham, and who was initially commanded to sacrifice his son Isaac on the altar, and was saved by an angel. And so, unlike the Mayan traditions and other religious traditions that have existed on the planet, the Jewish tradition has never had human sacrifice, period, as a religious ritual, human sacrifice. Now, we're going to talk about other kinds of sacrifices, including martyrdom later on, but it was not ritualistic human sacrifice that was ever a part of the Jewish tradition. So that is itself a segue for the broader message of sacrifice that I wanted to share with you. What is the notion then of sacrifice? We talked about the root, karev, being close to, mikarev, to the intensified form, to be closer to God, to take action to bring ourselves closer to God on some level. In the ancient world, when there was certainly situations of non-intentional error and non-willful error, nonetheless that mistakes were made, certainly not premeditated or intentional, they brought animal sacrifices. But the notion of sacrifices itself is really giving something up. In the case of the animal sacrifice, they had an animal in their herd, their flock, and that had an economic value, especially in an agricultural society. It had an economic value. Mark wanted to add something.
I was just thinking, didn't sacrifice become less and less important? And it was like just for minor sins, like you lit a fire on Shabbat because you thought it was Sunday or something?
Well, that would have been a big offense, actually. So as long as the temple times were in existence, I think they kept the whole system and kept it going full speed. After the second temple was destroyed, they couldn't do those animal sacrifices anymore. And so there was a line in the Bible that they fell on: let our prayers be as the sacrifices and the offerings of bullocks. Let the prayers of our lips be that. And then with the institution of small communities like this, scattered throughout the world, that's how Judaism survived and would go on to survive for the next 2,000 years. But there are other levels of sacrifices as well that I wanted to talk about. All of you who have children who are fortunate to have a successful life, by the way, how would Judaism define a successful life? Ideally, being able to grow up with a sense of reverence for God, get married, have children, and pass the legacy and heritage on to them. And so many of you have done that. And that is success that money cannot buy. And in the process of that, each of you made many, many sacrifices. Whether it be just putting up with the baby screaming and hollering, getting up in the wee hours of the night to take care of an infant's needs, guiding them as they grew, putting them in early childhood education, the earliest kindergarten, first grade, helping them with school, making their lunches, carpooling them, everything that a parent does. Everything that a parent does. It's all sacrifice. It's giving something up. Why? For a greater sense of purpose, a greater sense of meaning, a greater sense of this is what we are supposed to do. This is what we are enjoying to do, and that originating from that very deep feeling that gives you the strength to make all of those sacrifices. So also sacrifices that are made for other people, maybe not your own children, to build the community, to strengthen the community, leadership of a synagogue, volunteering on committees and being part of things. That's all a degree of sacrifice on not only then the personal level, but also building up institutions on the communal level. Supporting Jewish institutions, the concept of the federation. Yes, it's a sacrifice to donate time, effort, and money to build that up. But these are institutions that which then have a legacy and a continuity of their own that indeed can go beyond a single person's lifetime. And then we think of broader levels of sacrifices, right? Think of the sacrifice of those who served in our military at the various points. World War I, World War II, the veterans of World War II, Jewish veterans also participated. And so I have something that is going to be unbelievable to many people. But in point of fact, I have a medallion. You remember the Wizard of Oz at the end of the journey there, he gave people tokens to remember things. So at a service, I believe this was actually in Florida here, we had a service honoring Jewish war veterans, and I was given this medallion, which is presented by basically under the auspices of the Jewish war veterans of the United States. And this was presented to me. I'm going to hold it up so that everyone can see in the camera in just a minute, although you won't be able to maybe get the fine view here. But this was presented to me by a national commander of Jewish war veterans. His name is Harvey Weiner, and he was a national commander, and this was the years 2019 to 2020. Yes, this was the year that I was serving in Boynton Beach as a rabbi, and we had a service commemorating the veterans, and he gave me this, and never did I think that I would be using it as a prop, as a show and tell for a service that would be broadcast nationally, indeed, internationally, and here for perpetuity. So we recall the many sacrifices, which were really, in great reminder by this organization, the Jewish War Veterans of the United States. The many sacrifices of Jewish service personnel, as well as all people of all backgrounds and all religions for our country. That is the notion of sacrifice. And of course, it wasn't just World War II. We'll come back to World War II in just a second, but there are many Jews who served in subsequent wars. In the Korean War, my uncle, Frederick Hazzard, is a veteran of that war. And many other, many are still alive, veterans of the Korean War generation, of the Korean War. And then, of course, Vietnam, and then the Iraqi campaigns, and then, continuing through the present service in the military. Of course, the most tragic and ultimate form of sacrifice was giving up one's life for the sake of a cause, for the sake of our people, for the sake of martyrdom, to not give up the Jewish tradition, and that involves the story of the Holocaust. A unique period of our history, unique episode. And the word for martyrdom comes from the same root for sanctification, the root kuf kadesh, kuf dalet shin kadesh. So kiddush, we have a kiddush that we say over wine, but when you make it in a construct form, kiddush Hashem, I told this to my class, I think, is when you put it in this form, Kiddush Hashem, the sanctification of the name. What does the name refer to? To God. So that's the ultimate sacrifice. Now, let's bring it also home to the experiences of most Americans. All Americans will be able to, all people in the world who survived this last 2 years will remember the sacrifices, all the sacrifices and shifts that were made for our COVID period. The many who died, the ultimate sacrifice. Those who helped those as they were dying, that was a sacrifice and a risk. All of the changes that we've made as a society, everyone's had to sacrifice something in order to survive. And many of us, we're still wearing masks now. Some, not only in this sanctuary, but even many out and about. So there are many sacrifices that we've made on many different levels. as individuals, as families, as Jews, as a people, as citizens, and as living beings on the planet. So I just wanted to share that with you here in a way, in an effort to broaden the concept of a book in Leviticus here, which on the surface seems to only talk about slaughtering animals and not relating to the human condition as in the larger picture, which I hope we reminded us of just now. Amen. And actually, let me make a transition also to the Haftorah. I mentioned earlier, and I'll give you a page number for this transition here. If you'll turn to page 1280, we have the Haftorah. Then actually, I promised that we would go back to the book of Deuteronomy. We would go back to the book of Deuteronomy. Just a momentito. Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 17 through 19. So I'll give you the page in that in one moment here. So it is in the book of Deuteronomy that we read then, as I mentioned, of Amalek here, as he very cowardly, right, was attacking the Israelites with the weakest part of the group, the stragglers left behind, those feeble, and that it didn't take much. It's a despicable act because it doesn't take much courage to pick on someone who's weaker, right? And these guys are on horseback, just like the certain individuals were on horseback in Canada, and running over a lady doesn't take much courage, or a protester there. So, page 1135, let's read and quote this. Remember what Amalek did to you. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. How? Undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary, and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. I want to look at the word for stragglers there. It basically is becha kol nechashalim. So those who are like feeble, who are nechshal, feeble and not able to strongly defend themselves. Therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you, in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, you shall blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. Now, this is on page 1136. So you shall blot out the name of the memory, right? Timche, to blot it out. Et zecher. But then it says, lo tishkach, don't forget. So you're commanded not to forget, to block out, which seems a little contradictory, but it shows how we can work on several levels there, right? You might remember something in order to negate it. Therefore, now I'd like to invite everyone to turn to page 1280, and we have then the story of Shmuel and Shaul, the king, the first king. Now, Shmuel, was the first prophet, and he really, was amongst those chosen. In the beginning, people clamored for a king, and God certainly was not too eager to fulfill that. But Samuel was appointed a prophet, and Samuel was told to anoint Shaul as king. But there were certain limitations, and there were certain rules and regulations. And then this king was commanded, that is Shaul, to destroy all of the Amalekites and to completely wipe them out. The people, the women, the children. This was rather harsh, but it was God's command at the time. When he spared it's funny, the text tells us that Shaul had pity and compassion on the animals, but not on the Amalekite people. And he had compassion for basically Agag, the leader. One could make the opposite case, that he should have had compassion not for the leader, but for the people. In other words, the lowlings there, because they were commanded. They didn't have much choice. But it's like not blaming. It's like having compassion on the despot, but not having compassion on the victims of the despot, even some of his own citizens. So that was a little. When I reread that here and studied that, it's a little strange, but nonetheless, he had compassion upon Agag, didn't want to slaughter him. Maybe he had respect for military leadership or something like that. But that was against what he was commanded to do, and so by that violation of not following God's instructions, he lost his kingship, and he did so very dramatically. So I want to point out here. On page, I'm going to chant it this morning. But before I do, on page 1282, verse 10, the word of the Lord came to Samuel. I regret that I made Saul king, for he has turned away from me, has not carried out my commands. So Saul tried to interject here by prayers, making a monument, offering sacrifices, etc. And you have some famous lines here. Let's read it in English first, and then we'll go back and I'll do it in the Hebrew. And this is the page 1283, verse 13. When Samuel came to Saul, Saul said to him, "Blessed are you of the Lord." So this is what Saul said. He said, like Baruch Hashem, basically. Baruch atah Adonai. Hakimoti et dvar Adonai, I have fulfilled with the law what God commanded of me. But then, Vayomer Shmuel answered, Ume koratzon hazeh be'oznai. What is this bleating of sheep in my ears that I am hearing? V'kol habakar, and by the way, not just the sheep, the oxen, right? Asher anochi shomea, that I'm hearing. And Samuel says, well, they were just brought from the Amalekites, for the troops spared the choices of the sheep and oxen, ostensibly for a good reason. He's trying to, come back now, make up a good excuse for sacrificing to God. We want him to sacrifice these to God. Samuel said to Saul, he lost his patience in the very beginning. Just like stop. Like, don't say anything more. Let me tell you what's happening here. And the Hebrew is Et asher diber Adonai elai halayla. Let me tell you what the Lord, by the way, told me last night. The text doesn't say by the way, but I'm adding that. And then he's gonna really put Saul in his place here. So Samuel is saying in verse 17, and Samuel said, "You may look small to yourself, and haroim katon ata be'enecha. You might look small to yourself. Rosh Shivtei Yisrael ata. But nonetheless, you are the head of the tribes of Israel. And the Lord anointed you king over Israel for a purpose. And the Lord sent you on a mission, saying, wipe them out, basically. And then he says, why did you disobey, in verse 19, why did you disobey the Lord and swoop down on the spoil in defiance of the Lord's will? And Saul's trying to come up with excuses now, but I did obey the Lord. I performed the mission. And by the way, so the troops took some spoil, some sheep and the best, and we took, basically we wiped out most of the people, but I didn't slaughter their leader, Agag. And then Samuel said, and these were verses that my teacher, while I was learning this, early teacher, Ben Zion Bergman, I wanted us to memorize these verses here, right? Does the Lord delight in burnt sacrifices and burnt offerings and sacrifices as much to obedience to the Lord's command? It's a rhetorical question. The answer is absolutely not, right? Surely obedience is better than sacrifice, compliance than the fat of rams. Hine shomea mizerach tov. That listening to God is better than sacrificing things. And then, as in biblical poetry, he repeats the motive, or repeats the motif. Lakshiv mechelev elim. Compliance, listening to God, paying attention, rather than the sacrifice of rams. And then he says, for rebellion is like the sin of divination, defiance, like the iniquity of terafim, like idols. Because you rejected God's command, and here you have a play on words in a way, or using the same words. Ya'an ma'asta et devar Adonai, because you have rejected, from the root here, aleph, or me'as, I guess mem aleph samech. Because you have rejected God, then vayim asacha mimelech. That's an example of the passive form. You have the active, you have rejected, therefore God will reject you. Vayim asacha. That's the perfect example how you can go from an active to a passive tense with Hebrew grammar. And then Saul asks for forgiveness. Samuel says, I'm not going to go back. And then as Samuel's turning to leave, Saul sees the corner of his robe and it tore. Did anyone ever see him? There was a movie once upon a time that dramatized this story. And it showed Saul reaching out for Samuel's robe. And the robe tears. I saw it. It was very dramatic, the way they filmed it. And Samuel said, using the same language, the Lord has this day torn the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another who is worthier than you. So, and the word kara, Adonai, kara, to tear, kuf reish ayin. So what do we do at a funeral service when you tear your garments? To symbolize on the outside how you feel torn to the inside. What do we call that? Kriya. Same root. Kuf reish aleph. Okay. And then God is not like a human being, the next point. Moreover, the glory of Israel does not deceive or change his mind, for he is not human, that he should change his mind. Saul is asking for a final chance, and Samuel says no, basically. He does one thing. Saul does one thing here. In verse 30, he says, I did wrong. Please honor me in the presence of my elders, of my people, and in the presence of Israel, and come back with me until I have bowed low to the Lord. Notice he says, your God, instead of my God. But nonetheless, Samuel followed him back. And Saul did bow low. But then, what happens at the end of our Haftarah? He brings out Agag in chains. And what did Agag say? Bitter death is at hand. He knew that Samuel wasn't being fooling. Samuel didn't have these wishy-washy feelings. He knew that Samuel was up for business here. He was going to get executed momentarily. And Samuel said, now you're getting your karmic payback, Agag. As your sword has bereaved women, so shall your mother be bereaved among women. And he cut him down. He basically killed him. And that's the end of the Haftarah. Quite dramatic, isn't it?
Yes.
So I think I'm going to attempt to do that here. It's a little bit longer, but I'm going to attempt to do that since we weren't able to have a Torah reading at the moment. Okay. So This begins then on page 1281. And of course, before we engage in the actual reading of the Haftorah, there is a blessing that we do beforehand. And so I'm going to head, that's on page 326. And for those new to this, you'll notice that the melody, the melodic pattern of musical motifs that I do for the blessing is incorporated in the pattern motifs that we use for the actual reading, chanting of the prophetic portion. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar b'nviim tovim v'retzav v'divreihem hane'emarim be'emet. Baruch atah Adonai abocher b'torah ובמשה עבדו, ובישראל עמו, ובנביאי האמת והצדק. And for those students in my Hebrew class, I'll point out as I'm chanting the Haftorah, you're a little bit more advanced now than the last time I chanted Haftorah. So as your individual following with this and mini assignment here, as I'm chanting the Haftorah, and you're recognizing and recognizing the words more accurately now with the appropriate vowels, also pay attention to the diacritical markings, basically the trope markings, because almost invariably, where you will find the mark for the trope, for the Torah cantillation, is the same syllable on which you'll have the stress on the word. So you are sort of doing several things at the same time to reinforce each other. Vayomer Shmuel, I'm sorry, page 1281. Vayomer Shmuel el Shaul, Oti shalach Adonai, nimshachacha lemelech al amo al Yisrael, ve'ata shema lekol divrei Adonai. Ko amar Adonai tzvaot pakadti et asher asa Amalek Yisrael asher sam lo baderech baroto mimitzrayim ve'ata lech vikita et Amalek החרמתם את כל אשר לו ולא תחמול עליו והמתה והבהמתה מאיש עד אישה מעולל ועד יונק מישור ועד שא מגמל ועד חמור. וישמע שאול את העם, ויפקדם בתלאים 200,000 רגלי 10,000 את איש יהודה. ויבוא שאול עד עיר עמלק, וירב בנחל, ויאמר שאול אל הקני לכו סורו רדו מתוך עמלקי ונוסיפך עמו
ואתה עשית חסד עם כל בני ישראל, בעלותם ממצרים, ויסר קני מתוך עמלק. ויך שאול את עמלק מחבילה בואכה אשור אשר על פני מצרים. ויתפוס את אגג מלך עמלק חי, ואת כל העם החריד לפי חרב. ויחמול שאול והעם על אגג ועל מיטב הצאן והבקר המשנים ועל הכרים ועל כל הטוב, ולא אבו החרימם, וכל המלאכה מבצע ונמס אותה החרימו.
We're on page 1282, verse 10, continuing.
ויהי דבר אדוני אל שמואל לאמור, ניחמתי כי המלכתי את שאול למלך, כי שב אחרי את דברי לא הקים. וייחר משמואל ויזעק אל אדוני כל הלילה. וישכם שמואל לקראת שאול בבוקר, ויוגד לשמואל לאמור, בשאול הכרמלה, והנה מציב לו יד, יסוב ויעבור וירד הר גלגל.
Verse 13.
ויבוא שמואל אל שאול, ויאמר לו שאול, ברוך אתה לאדוני הקימותי את דבר אדוני. ויאמר שמואל, ומה כל הצאן הזה באוזני, וכל הבקר אשר אנוכי שומע. ויאמר שאול, מעמלקי הביאו, אשר חמל העם על מיטב הצאן והבקר למען זבוח לאדוני אלוהיך, ואל היותר החרמנו. ויאמר שמואל אל שאול, חרף אגידה לך את אשר דיבר אדוני אלי הלילה. ויאמר לא דבר. ויאמר שמואל, הלא אם קטון אתה בעיניך, ראש שבטי ישראל אתה, וימשכך אדוני למלך על כל ישראל, וישלחך אדוני בדרך, ויאמר לך ואחרימת לך ורחמתם את חטאים ואת עמלק, ונלחמתי בו עד כרותם אותם. ולמה לא שמעת בקול אדוני וטעת אל השלל ותעש הרע בעיני אדוני? ויאמר שאול אל שמואל, אשר שמעתי בקול אדוני, ואלה בדרך אשר שלחני אדוני, ואביא את אגג מלך עמלק, ואת עמלק החרמתי. ויקח העם מהשלל צאן ובקר ראשית החרם, לזבוח לאדוני אלוהיך בגלגל. ויאמר שמואל, יחפץ לאדוני בעולות וזבחים, כי שמוע בקול אדוני. הנה שמוע מזבח טוב, להקשיב מחלב אלים, כי חטאת קסם מרי, ועוון וטרפים חבצר יען. ועשת את דבר אדוני, וימאסך ממלך. ויאמר שאול אל שמואל, חטאתי, כי עברתי את פי אדוני ואת דבריך, כי יראתי את העם ואשמע בקולם. ואתה שנא את חטאתי, ושוב עמי ואשתחווה לאדוני. ויאמר שמואל אל שאול, לא אשוב עמך, כי מאסת את דבר אדוני, וימאסך אדוני מיות מלך על ישראל. Verse 27. ויסוב שמואל ללכת, ויחזק בכנף מעילו, ויקרא, ויאמר אליו שמואל, קרא אדוני את המלכות ישראל מעליך היום, ותננה לערך הטוב ממך, וגם נצח ישראל לא ישקר ולא ינחם, כי לא אדם הוא להנחם. ויאמר חטאתי אתה, כבדני נא נגד זקני עמי ונגד ישראל, ושוב עמי, והשתחוויתי לאדוני אלוהיך. וישב שמואל אחרי שאול, וישתחו שאול לאדוני. ויאמר שמואל, הגיש אלי את אגג מלך עמלק, וילך אליו אגג מאדנות. ויאמר אגג, אכן שר מר המוות. ויאמר שמואל, כאשר שכלה נשים נשים חרבך, כן תשכל נשים עמך. וישסף שמואל את הגג לפני אדוני בגלגל. וילך שמואל הרמתה, ושאול עלה אל ביתו גבעת שאול.
So before I get out of the text of the Haftorah, I want to say that I was a little bit mistaken there in one aspect. Initially, Saul asked Samuel if he would follow him back and give him respect by following him back so he could bow low before the Lord. And initially, Samuel refused. At that point, that's when Shaul reached out, grabbed the robe, and then tore it. And then at that point, as we read, Samuel said, as much as you have torn my robe, so has the kingdom been now torn from you. But then he nonetheless did follow him back. So he gave him that little measure of respect back, but he did refuse it the first time. And by that point that he was following him back, at that moment and by that time, then Saul had already lost his kingship. So he followed him back, but it was in disgrace, really. It was in disgrace, because then, as we just read, he executed Agag in their presence and said, this is what you should have done, basically. On 326, the blessing afterwards.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, tzur kol ha'olamim, tzadik b'kol hadorot, ha'el ha'ne'eman ha'omer v'yoseh, ha'mdaber u'mkayem, shekol divarav emet b'tzedek. Ne'eman atahu Adonai Eloheinu, v'ne'emanim davarecha, ודבר אחד מדבריך, אחור לא ישוב ריקם, כי אל מלך נאמן ורחמן, אתה ברוך אתה אדוני, האל הנאמן בכל דבריו, רחם על ציון כי בית חיינו, ולעלוות נפש תושיע במהרה בימינו, ברוך אתה אדוני, משמח ציון בבניה, שמחנו אדוני אלוהינו, באליהו הנביא עבדך, ובמלכות בית אביב משיחך, במהרה יבוא ויגע ליבנו, על כיסא לא ישב זר, ולא ינחלו עוד אחרים את כבודו, כי בשם קודשך נשבעת לו, שלא יכבה נרו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני מגן דוד, על התורה ועל העבודה ועל נביאים ועל יום השבת הזה, שנתת לנו אדוני אלוהינו לקדושה ולמנוחה, לכבוד ולתפארת. על הכל אדוני אלוהינו אנחנו מודים לך ומברכים אותך, יברך שמך בפי כל חי תמיד לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת, amen.
And I want to make one note. So, we put the Chumash away. In teaching in my class and helping individual students differentiate between the Chaf and the Kaf, namely the difference, the letter Chaf that has a guttural CH sound, Ch, and I advise my students to gargle 3 times a week for 5 minutes, all right? How many have done it? I don't want to embarrass you. Well, they can't see on the internet. Anybody gargled yet this week? Uh-oh. We need to gargle. That's the chaf sound. To German, it's the back of the larynx there. The chaf, as opposed to the kaf with the dot in it. It's like an English K. Now, when you have the chaf at the end of a word, and those in my class remember sometimes you have the 2 dots that brings the previous vowel, you still pronounce it the soft CH. I said in the vast majority of cases, unless you may have a dot in the kaf, the final kaf, which gives it a K sound. And indeed, I wanted to point out this especially here for instruction for Tom in the verse here. The Lord this day has torn the kingship away from over Israel from the kingship over Israel away from you and has given it to another, who's given it to another neighbor, hatov mimeka, better than you, mimeka. And so that sounded, if you did hear, l'reacha hatov mimeka, it was correct. There is it's one of the few exceptions, and there is a dagesh, a dot in the final chaf. And the reason for that is that it is it's a third person singular possessive, but I'm wondering if that would be mimecha. It's just they. So now I'm tripping myself up, to be honest, in front of our international audience. I don't forget for a moment. We would have to, I can't give you a reason specifically why the dagesh is put in there, if not, except maybe only to emphasize it. But it's there. And so then it's pronounced mimeka, right? As in, michamocha banim alanayim, michamoka. That's we changed the chaf to the mikamocha for the second version of that. But occasionally you will find it. It's very rare. So before I trip myself up further, I will stop. And we'll continue with basically progressing to our... Does anyone have any questions, anything that I said in the sermon remarks or till this point in the service on our haftarah? Any questions? We can have questions.
What you're saying is that dot in the hay, right?
No, in the final chaf.
Oh, okay.
Yes, in the final chaf.
In the hay, what is that?
Well, that's also then called a mapik. And for my bar and bat mitzvah students, I give it a title, say we rendered that, we call it Mrs. Mapik. Now that's where the hay has a slight aspiration, but not as much as the het. And it forms, I can answer that for you. I mentioned it to my class once. That forms an indication of a third person singular possessive. Often, for example, siba is a reason. And it's usually in a feminine possessive. So it would be like, say, her reason would be sibah, and it's like very, very, very slight sibah, like that. It's almost like one of the sounds you'd have in Arabic. One of the very light aspirant sounds like that, sibah. But it's not as strong as the het, as strong as that. And of course, the het is higher in the throat, and the chaf is gargling. For our gargling assignment, double hint. It really helps. That's the gargling. Okay. Any other questions? So, third person singular possessive feminine. Her reason, siba. Yes.
I might remember that.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Let's go to our musaf, which we're going to do individually here, unless we have further notice. So, that begins. It's a silent prayer today. That will begin on page 357, page 357. And we'll continue. Well, here's an interpretive one. Let's see. That will go through page 370, I believe.
Does the musaf take the place of the sacrifice?
Yes. Well, the musaf, not exactly. The musaf was the additional sacrifice that they made on Shabbat. Yes. So that's why we have retained it in our service as symbolic of that original sacrifice. So we'll invite everyone to please rise, face our eastern wall for some moments of individual prayer. if you're continuing your private prayers, you may continue to do so individually. I just want to make a note that in some ways I was very remiss when I was speaking about sacrifices. I absolutely also had intended, I had definitely intended to include the sacrifices that were made for the establishment of the sake of Israel, the state of Israel, all the initial efforts of the Chalutzim, the initial settlers, then those lost, the lives lost in the Israeli First War of Independence, and then the 56 Sinai campaign, and the 67-day war, the Yom Kippur War, through the present time. And then, of course, as a congregation, I think it's very important that we give our prayers to all of the suffering and the sacrifices that is going on right at this moment in Europe, in the Ukraine, having so many people sacrificing their lives, either in the name of freedom, from the point of view of the Ukrainians, and so much life simply being lost in such tremendous levels of tragedy. And so we hope and pray that there will be a cessation of this war, if possible, sooner rather than later. Because the longer it goes, the more sacrifices and lives lost, unfortunately. So, but we would be remiss, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in the context of the whole notion of sacrifice and with respect to my earlier message. So we have said the blessing for those who are ill, and then we also mentioned the birthdays and celebrations. And at least I want to mention the names of. Well, first let's go here to our Aleinu prayer, and that is an important prayer, and that is found on page 402. Page 402. And we'll rise and face our eastern wall again. Aleinu nishabeach ladon hakol latet gudula leotzeh breshit shelo asan kogayei ha'aratzot velo samanu kemishpachot ha'adama shelo sam chelkeinu kahem vegor aleinu kechol hamonam v'anachnu korim umishtachavim umodim lifnei melech malchei hamlachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu Shehu notei shamayim v'yosed haaretz u'moshav yikaro v'shamayim imal u'shchinatu zo b'gavei meromim Hu Eloheinu ein od emet malkeinu efes zulato kakatu b'torato v'yadata yom v'hashevota el levavecha Ki Adonai hu Elohim b'shamayim mimal v'al haaretz mitachat ein od al ken ונאמר והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. And please be seated. So even though I do want to mention by name here those whose Yortzeit Nark observed on this Shabbat. So that is Larry Gilbraith, husband of Nancy Gilbraith, on this Shabbat and during the coming week. Larry Gilbraith, husband of Nancy Gilbraith, Carlos Rodriguez, friend of Osvaldo Gonzalez and Wanda Garcia, Gertrude Allman, grandmother of Greg Allman, Irene M. Berman, sister of Carolyn Kaplan, and Sima Levine, mother of Stanley Levine. And at this time, before we have a concluding hymn, at least in part of Don Olam, I'd like to invite our congregation president, Tom Mayer, to come up and share some announcements.
Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our guests. I think Olga and Carla, thank you for being here. We appreciate it very much. Rabbi, thank you so much for leading us in services and your beautiful hot Torah reading. Very, very nice. Tomorrow we have our play. It's called Parade. It's at the Winter Garden Theater. If you're going, it's at 2 p.m. It's supposed to be an award-winning play, so I'm looking very forward to that tomorrow afternoon. Also, this coming Wednesday, we have our Purim celebration. It'll be at the home of Eric and Lisa Alpert. Bring your crazy hats, bring your groggers, make noises. We will be reading the Megillah and having a fun night for everyone. And we've ordered our new prayer books. They're called Sim Shalom. They should be in probably within a couple of weeks. That's exciting. And last of all, don't forget to turn your clocks forward tonight. You're going to lose an hour's sleep, but daylight savings time starts tomorrow, so you need to change your clocks overnight. Shabbat Shalom.
Unless you're retired, then you can wake up.
Thank you so much, Tom, for those announcements and also for the reminder of the daylight savings time. I had remembered it and then forgotten it, so then it's good to have the reminder again. To conclude here, let's, on page 402, let's do the first stanza and the last of Adon Olam. We'll do the traditional melody here today. Adon Olam Asher Malach B'terem Kol Yitzir Nivra Le'et Nasa B'chefzo Kol Azai Melech Shemo Nikra B'yado Avkid Ruchi Beit Ishan Ve'ayira V'im Ruchi Gviati Adonai Li Velo ira. Shabbat Shalom.
I appreciate it. Yeah, I learned a little bit.
Good. I'm glad to hear that.
I remember you were talking about the kaf with the dot in it, but I'm talking about the hey. I never knew what the